pawb, good morning everyone. So welcome to this month's Business Swansea Enterprise Club session on leasing commercial premises and pop-ups for startups. If you'd like to watch any of our previous sessions, then you can watch them back via our Business Swansea YouTube channel. I will put the link in the chat later. Before we start, can I remind you that this session is recorded, so if you'd prefer for your face not to be shown, please turn off your camera by clicking the camcorder icon at the top of your screen. This session will also be uploaded onto our YouTube channel. Firstly, I think it would be a good idea for everyone to introduce themselves, tell us why you've registered to attend today, and you can tell the group a bit about your business or organisation and what you're looking to get out of today. So first of all, if I can go to the two people from Distill and Fill. Tell us a bit about yourselves, your business, and why you've joined today.
Yeah, so I'm Jenny and this is Phil. We are Distill and Fill, so we have a bottled cocktail business that we started just under a year ago, based in Swansea. So we create a range of bottled cocktails and do consultancy for bars and restaurants in the Wales area. We joined today because we are looking for our own premises this year. The idea being we want to start a micro distillery and allow us to kind of expand the business in the area. Yeah,
and then hopefully offer a place where we can give trainings to staff. So basically set up like a little school. So where what a lot of brands do is they'll offer cash retros for spirits. So say you buy it 16 quid at the end of the year, depending on how many bottles you buy, you might get £1 or £2 back per bottle. Our idea would be that we would say, well, we would sell these spirits, but we would actually offer our services, and you bring your staff to our school and we could teach them how to bartend and teach them about GPs and drink development and stuff like that as part of our support rather than giving people back cash.
Oh, fantastic. Well, that's great. Thanks for joining today. I forgot to mention, my name's Stephen Williams. I'm from Business Swansea, Swansea Council, providing business support, advice and guidance to startups and established businesses. So Ben, can we have a quick intro from yourself?
Sorry, I'm assuming that I'm the only Ben on here. So
sorry, Ben.
Yeah. So morning, everybody. My name is Ben Reynolds. I'm going to be doing the presentation on taking on a premises. So I'll tell you more about who we are and what we do when I actually start giving the presentation. So I'll do that when we get going.
Great, thanks. And we've got Diana here. Diana, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself, your business, and why you're here today?
Yeah, no problem. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, I'm Diana McDougall. I'm just in the start of starting a business. It's going to be sundry wholesalers, and I'm a mother carer for my son. So now I just thought he's in school all day, so I just thought it was time for me to do something for me. So, and that's more or less it.
Oh, fantastic, Diana. Thanks for joining us today. We got Fionn here. Fionn, quick intro.
Hiya, yeah, I'm Fionn from an organisation called Co-Wine. We work with food and drink producers, and I look after the Swansea and Neath Talbot area. I'm here today just to learn more and just to see what the project's about.
Great. We've got Hindi Satsang on the call as well. Hi Hindi. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Apologies for that. I actually volunteer in a spiritual group, and so I'm one of the admins. So yeah, and it's all done in the language of Hindi. So, and I couldn't change it.
Okay.
So my name is Babita, and I have a small business here in Swansea. We do so we're an Indian deli. So we're at the markets, local markets, Uplands, Marina, Mumbles markets, and various others. We do pop-up kitchens, and the dream is to one day open up a little deli. So selling ready-made Indian food, snacks, spices, nice sweets, that kind of thing, something a little bit different. So I thought this would be a great opportunity just to see, what it would take to run or have a pop-up place, just to give it a trial run. So really looking forward to the session.
Oh, great. Thanks for joining us. And Howell Bassett.
Hi everyone, I'm Howell Bassett. I'm a business advisor with Business Wales. Business Wales offers a range of support to both pre-start and established businesses. We also do starting your business webinars and webinars for growing businesses. There's a ream of information on the Business Wales website, so if you haven't made contact with Business Wales, I recommend that you have a good look at the Business Wales website. So thank you.
Thanks, Hal. And my esteemed colleague, Matt Callahan.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Matt Callahan, part of the Business Swansea team at Swansea Council. As Steve mentioned earlier, looking after the business engagement, business support function of the economic development team at Swansea Council. A number of initiatives, one of which is the Business Power Hour, which also runs on a monthly basis. And I'll come back and tell you a little bit more about that later in the session towards the end.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, so moving on, the purpose of these sessions are to cover all the essential topics relevant to starting a business. We've engaged with the local business community who will supply us with a different business expert every month to facilitate these sessions. Our guest speaker today is Ben Reynolds, Director of Urban Foundry. Urban Foundry are currently contracted to deliver the Meanwell Space project in Swansea, which repurposes empty commercial units in the city and supports startups to utilise these spaces to test trade their products or services. Ben has a wealth of experience in starting up businesses and passes on this knowledge to young entrepreneurs in his role as a big ideas role model for the Welsh Government. He is also currently the entrepreneur residence for Swansea University, and we are delighted that he's given up his valuable time today to attend this session. You will have the opportunity to ask any questions at the end of Ben's presentation, or you can write your questions in the chat and we'll go through them at the end. For those who are not familiar too much with Teams, the chat is the speech bubble at the top of the screen. I'd also politely ask you to mute your microphones to avoid any background noise which could distract the group whilst Ben is delivering his presentation. So Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Steve. So good morning, everybody. So my name is Ben Reynolds. I'm the founder and director of a company based here in Swansea called Urban Foundry. Urban Foundry I describe as a creative regeneration agency. And we started in 2004. What we do is we work across the UK as far as possible. We try and work in South Wales because it's nice to be on our own doorstep. And we do projects that are about either improving people's lives, making better places, or building businesses with purpose. And so usually those three things overlap to a fair degree. And we work with the public, non-profit and private sectors. Where we work with the private sector tends to be at the sort of startup micro enterprise end of the spectrum. And similarly with third sector organisations, we tend to be working with those who are just getting going or just setting themselves up and just sort of starting their journey. We do work with bigger ones, but that tends to be where our focus is. We're a purpose-driven company. We're Swansea's first and currently only, but I'd be very welcome if anybody would like to join us. We're Swansea's first B Corp. We're only the second one in Wales, which we're very proud of. What a B Corp is, if you're not familiar with it, is it's an independent accreditation that shows that you are meeting the highest standards of ethics, transparency, and sustainability as a business. We are a for-profit company. We're not a charity or anything, and it's a way of us showing that we practice what we preach, and we don't just sort of tell other people to do it. We do it ourselves. What makes us a little bit different to some of the other sort of organisations who are in our kind of what you might broadly call the kind of consultancy or kind of management consulting type field is that as well as doing projects for other people, we do projects for ourselves. So sometimes we just do things because we just think they're a nice idea. Nobody commissions us to do them. We just set them up and start them off. And that's true of some of the people on the call today. I recognise from our street markets project. That was one that nobody commissioned us to do. I live in Swansea. I live in the Uplands. I have done since I was 2 years old, and just thought, well, that's just a nice thing that we could do. It's about placemaking. It's about getting people into space and building footfall, but it's also a place for effectively incubating 40, 50 micro businesses every month, and they're all artisan businesses. They're all local. All bar one of them are from within the region, and 50, 60% of them are actually from within Swansea, and it's all about artisan produce. I'm very proud to say we've been approached on many times by big name brands because they've seen the footfall that we get at the markets, and we say no. It's all about micro business. It's about startups, and linked to that is what I'm going to talk to you about today. So markets are kind of what you might call pop-up urbanism. They're a way of kind of making temporarily changing urban space in a way that that fosters both economic, social, and to a certain degree environmental regeneration. It sort of improves spaces. And what I'm going to talk to you about today are what's called meanwhile or pop-up spaces, which are, if you like, are the indoor equivalent of sort of doing a pop-up event or market in an outdoor space. Meanwhile space is nothing new. It's been around for ages. It's only been called meanwhile space relatively recently, but the sort of cultural creative sector has done meanwhile spaces for 40, 50, 60 years. They just didn't call it meanwhile spaces. What it used to be called is easy in, easy out terms for using commercial spaces. But it's taken on a sort of, since the millennium really, it's taken on a bit more of a kind of mainstream sort of focus, where more people are doing it, and it's sort of becoming, if you like, a tool of regeneration. And that was happening anyway. And of course, now we've had a pandemic for nearly 2 years, and we've got rather a lot of empty spaces now in town centres. It's not entirely new. We've got, the retail sector was contracting anyway. Our town centres were heavily reliant on retail. That was happening regardless of COVID because of the rise of online shopping, out of town shopping, those sorts of things. So this was a trend anyway. What COVID has done is supercharged that trend. So whereas before it would have taken 5 or 10 years for that decline to occur, it's now happening over sort of 18 months to 2 years, where we're having to re-envision the landscape because everybody's had to fast forward, think about online sales and about how people will engage with their businesses differently. And a lot of that has made us rethink what are our town centres for, and when I say town centres, it's not just city centres. It might be places in Swansea like Sketty or Uplands or Mumbles or Gorseinon, those sort of, if you like, second tier centres, the next step down from the city centre, but they are still sort of commercial centres. And a part of that discussion really is about, well, okay, we've got more empty spaces. What are we going to do with them? How are we going to repurpose them at a time when the economy is rather still very volatile? There's a lot of uncertainty around. So how do we make that happen? So whilst we were started on this journey beforehand, it's giving it a new dimension now because of the COVID recovery process, which is it's not just about how do we re-envision the way that towns and cities are changing. It's now about we've also got to deal with the fallout from COVID, but the mechanism is kind of the same. So what I'll just quickly do is I'm just going to run through you through some of the examples of what we've done as Meanwhile Spaces. And when I said that we do projects for ourselves and then we also do commissioned work for third parties, this is a sort of a hybrid of the two, in that we started out doing Meanwhile Spaces just for ourselves, like we did with street markets. We just thought they were a nice idea. And then people saw what we were doing and said, we like this, can we commission you to do more of them? And so it sort of morphed from something we started ourselves into something we've now been commissioned to do by Welsh Government and by Swansea Council. At the moment, we're at sort of a pilot stage of expanding it. So we were just starting to grow the process now, having done a series of pilots. So you're coming in kind of at the beginning of this process. But what I'll do is try and give you a bit of a flavour of what it is, and then I'll finish off with sort of some of the general pointers about whether it's meanwhile lease or not, just some of the general pointers about over the years having worked with lots of micro businesses who are ready to take that jump of taking on their first premises or whatever, of sort of some of the key kind of lessons that that I would sort of convey to someone of the key things to look out for if you're just starting on that journey. I will preface what I say by saying I'm an expert in urban regeneration. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert in property law. So if your questions are specifically about kind of legal things, you'll have to park that for a later one when it comes to maybe getting a solicitor into one of these sorts of sessions. But I can certainly answer questions in broad terms about kind of the specifics about things to look out for, that type of stuff. So I'll do a quick sort of intro to it, what it's about, kind of some examples, and then I'll open it up to Q&A, because I generally find with these sorts of sessions, I do a lot of these types of things on a variety of subjects, that usually the most benefit people get out of it is the specific thing that they're interested in, which will come out in a Q&A. So I'll try not to spend too long on the general concept. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So this is one of the ones that we did, which is quite a big one. So this is at the bottom of Wine Street, on Little Wine Street there, which is now the Beer Keller venue. But for 5 or 6 years, it was empty. It was an old nightclub. What happened to the nightclub sector, if you're familiar with that? I'm way past the age where I go to those sorts of places anymore. I was once dragged into this for somebody's 30th birthday. I think I lasted about 20 minutes when it was a nightclub. But it was sort of on the fringes. If you think of Wine Street, and a lot of this stems from geography. We'll come into that a bit later. But location is something to always remember in your head. And as that market contracted a little bit, the first ones to go are usually the ones around the edges, of which this was one. It's not a very big distance from the middle of Wine Street to where this one is, but it's just far enough that it was just too far out. And so it has sat empty for 4 or 5 years. And I happened to be doing some other work for the landlord separate to this, and we wandered past this one day, and I just said, "Oh, what are you doing at that?" And so we can't let it. So I just said, "Well, just give it to us then. We'll just take it, and we'll just do something interesting with it." And so the basic premise of meanwhile leases is that you get them on either very low cost or free rent. And in return for that, what you do is you sign over in a legal sense. It's a thing called the Landlord and Tenant Act. You don't need to worry about the detail of it. Is what you do is you effectively sign away what used to be called your squatter's rights. Okay, so after you've been in a space for 6 months, you have certain legal protections, right? It's to stop unscrupulous landlords sort of, you'd spend a load of money doing up a space and then they kick you out. And so the Landlord and Tenant Act is there, it's both for domestic and for commercial premises. It's there to sort of protect you, so that if you've made a load of investment, you kind of get like a first refusal. And what you do with the meanwhile space is you opt out of that. So it retains full flexibility for the landlord. They can get rid of you at short notice. But the flip side of it is that for you is that if you don't really know if it's going to work or not, you're not really sure, it means that you can also give them really short notice. You're not tied into like a 3 or a 5 year lease. Or if you do sign a 3 or a 5 year lease with them, what you've got built into it is a very short term break clause. So quite often it's like a rolling 3 months notice process or something like that. So if you find you're doing something and it doesn't actually work, you can get out quick. The deal is that the landlord can do the same. So what meanwhile space is for testing things. It's for trying things out. There are other things you can do in meanwhile space. So people use them for sort of cultural projects and community projects and things like that, where they just want a space for 3 months. And the public sector often uses them as a way of just filling space. So they're just not empty. So they don't always have to be commercial uses, but because of the nature of the thing today, I'll focus mainly on commercial uses. If you want to talk about community and arts uses and things like that, I'm happy to do so. But that's the basic principle of a meanwhile space, is that's what's doing. Now, the benefit to the landlord of doing that is that when you're a landlord of a property, if it's empty, you have to pay empty business rates. So you'll be familiar with the idea of a taxation on businesses. So the premises equivalent of your domestic council tax is business rates. So it's a tax that you pay to the local authority, which then goes to Welsh Government, and it's based on the value of the property. When you're in occupation of the property, you pay that yourself as the occupier. When you're not in occupation, the landlord has to pay it. They get 3 months, where if somebody vacates, they get 3 months where it's free, and then they can bring it back in. There's 1 or 2 exemptions for things like if it's a listed building, there are 1 or 2 things like that where you don't have to pay. But in most instances, they then have to pay the equivalent of the business rates while it's empty. So in a very buoyant economy, that's not too much of a problem for landlords, because there's plenty of money washing around. They just build it into their business models. There will be times where it's empty and they have to pay it. At the moment, it's a massive problem because they've got huge amounts they're paying out with a relatively flat level of demand. And so they're far more so now, perhaps, than they were before, interested in ways of mitigating that risk to themselves. And one way of doing that is meanwhile space. So what they're doing is saying, well, yeah, I'm giving you my property for free, but I'm saving on my empty business rates. So what you do is you go in and you take responsibility for that property. You'll have a lease on it. You'll have a lease on it, and you will take the same responsibilities as you would sort of insuring it and paying the utilities costs and making sure it's secure and heated and lit and all the other things that you would do. But you're effectively removing rent, or if you are paying it, you're paying it at a very nominal level, maybe like the equivalent of a service charge. And what that means is that you can go in and you can do things at much lower cost in a space than you normally would. So it's not just the idea that you would have the flexibility of the long run, you're also reducing your costs in the short term. So here's a few examples of what we did with that. So this is one that we did at the bottom of Wine Street in the old empty nightclub. That's what it looked like before we took it. And what we did is we just turned it into a space where we just got we made a load of tables and chairs out of pallets, and we got a load of food traders in. Babita's on the call here was one of them, and we put food businesses around the edges. We put some live music on. We ran the bar, which was a way of paying for the space and the costs of doing it, and we turned it into effectively almost like a community space in the city, and that was a way of keeping the space going, keeping it heated, keeping it lit, keeping it secure. And there's quite a lot of emerging evidence that actually the benefit for landlords of doing this is that if a space has got meanwhile use in it, there's quite a good amount of evidence now that says it's more likely to be let than if they just leave it empty. And so there's a benefit to landlords of doing that. It's a relatively new thing, but in this part of the world, it's relatively new. But in other parts of the world, they've been doing this for donkey's years, and so there's quite a good evidence base of it. And so we could have people in there making it a social space. We turned the inside of it into a pop-up park for a while, and we did yoga sessions in there where we got people in to do that type of thing. Turned the outside from a very drab facade into something with a nice funky paint job on it, just to try and make it a bit more interesting, which then brought a bit of life to the street. Put some live music on in there, and that was sort of one of the early ones we did. And then, as I say, we morphed out to this. This is one we did with Swansea Uni. This is now, I've forgotten the name of it. It's the one next door to Zinco on Princess Way, which is just about to reopen. And it looked like that from the day they built it. It'd been sat empty. So we just worked with the uni, and we got one of their science exhibits in it. We did the Oriel Science Project, and they were able to then test this as an approach for them as a public body, and that then moved around the corner to what is now a permanent exhibition, which is on Castle Street on the corner there. But the pilot of it, which was this version you can see on the screen, that was just a pop-up that we did with them. And that's it looking from the other angle. Just nice, quick, cheap, fast, light kind of approach to doing it. But it sort of demonstrated the concept. It boosted footfall, which the neighbouring businesses, the cafes, loved, because it meant it just brought loads of people in that were going and buying in a coffee next door. And it just got some activity in the space, and it enabled them to test a project. This is one we did in a warehouse, so it just shows you can do these things, which isn't always the case that you've got to do them in town centres. This was one where we did actually up in North Yorkshire. I did this one with a mate of mine. This is when the MP Joe Cox was murdered, and if you remember, about 4 or 5 years ago up in Batley and Spen, my mate's a theatre director in the West End, and he wanted to do something for the kids of that community because they didn't have any activities, and he came out of the West Glamorgan Youth Theatre School, and there's no equivalent of it in Batley and Spen, but there's also no theatre there. So we just got Bernardo's to give us their warehouse, and we created a pop-up theatre, and we staged Les Mis, which was Joe Cox's favourite musical, and the kids of the local community were the cast, they were the crew, they were the marketing department, and we sort of taught them how to do all that sort of stuff, and there is now a long-term theatre project up there. But you can also do it really small scale. So this is one we did on College Street. We did this with a graduate of the university at UWTSD, Swansea Met as was then, very small shop unit, and we turned that into an art gallery. Not a public one, commercially, a commercial art gallery, which was selling the paintings and, that sort of activity. Again, difficult to make that work on a fully commercial basis, but take away the rent, it generated enough income to cover the costs of a body to be in there and pay the utilities, etc., etc. But you can see there's a pretty small unit. That's what 4 meters wide by about, sort of 10, 15 meters deep. So you can do these in quite small units, and that's it looking from the other angle. This is one we did very recently. This is in the Quadrant. So this was a pop-up shop before Christmas. So Cadwyn are a sort of craft shop. They do things like Welsh love spoons and all that sort of stuff. And they popped up for 6 weeks in the 6 weeks in the lead up to Christmas. And did a roaring trade there in the former unit that used to be the game shop, which was in the Quadrant Centre that used to sell computer games, and outfitted that space to do, kind of a craft pop-up pre-Christmas, and did very, very well in there. We also did one which I was hunting for the picture of and couldn't find beforehand, but we did one with the Environment Centre in one of the units opposite, where they did a pop-up shop for their refills. We're about to do one starting next week with somebody who does kind of, massage therapy and that type of stuff in a small pop-up unit, again, who in normal circumstances wouldn't be able to get anywhere near the rental levels that the Quadrant would charge, but we're able to get them into a space where they're just paying a nominal service charge per day. They can rent it by the day, they can rent it by the week, they can rent it by the month, and it's all based on very short-term turnover. The Quadrant's happy because it means they haven't got an empty unit and it's boosting their footfall, and it means that people can test trade stuff in a space that they normally wouldn't get anywhere near. So one of the things that we've done with this is, having done our own projects, we've kind of learned about the things which are sort of the barriers, if you like, to people going in and doing meanwhile spaces. And so what we've done is set up this project called PopUpWales. So you can, the website's literally just gone up. So it's popupwales.com. That's what it looks like on the front page. And what we've done on that is, having done them ourselves, we do regeneration for a living, so I kind of know how to jump through the hoops. But even I found it hard at times doing this sort of stuff. So what we thought we would do with this project, so okay, well, let's capture that learning to try and put a series of things in place that try and reduce, if not remove, the barriers to people going into spaces. So the first thing that we did was, normally when you go into a space, you'll end up with a legal agreement between you and the landlord. And what normally happens is the landlord will get their solicitor to draw up a legal agreement, which is entirely in favour of the landlord. And then you end up haggling and you try and meet somewhere in the middle, essentially is what the normal process is, which involves legal costs on both sides. Now, if you've got a 10-year lease on a place and you've agreed spending 20 grand a year or 30 grand a year or whatever, actually the legals in comparison to that as a cost are relatively minimal. But if you're only in a space for 3 months or 6 months, it's very hard to recover those costs. So what we did is we commissioned Morgan LaRoche solicitors in Swansea. And we said, right, what we want you to do is we want you to start in the middle. We want you to create something which equally protects the landlord and the tenant. So hopefully neither of them really got anything to haggle over, and create us effectively a fill in the blanks meanwhile space lease, which is specifically designed for short-term uses. So it's not going to help you if you want to take it a 20-year lease on something, but it's specifically designed for the short-term uses, and it's free to use, and it's literally just you fill in the blanks. And that's there then to give you kind of something that's been reasonably tested. It doesn't necessarily mean you don't need a lawyer, or I'd always suggest you do have your own lawyer. But it means that instead of spending 1,500 quid, 2 grand on your lawyer, you might be able to spend 200 or 300 quid on them to say, can you just look this over and just tell me that there's nothing major in here that's, you know, you've got a problem with, and hopefully it just reduces your costs down. The second thing that is a problem with meanwhile spaces, and is often a barrier, is around the nature and condition of the spaces. So some cities, so if you go to London, this stuff, because they have such high turnover of spaces, because there's huge demand, but there's also huge amounts of space, so there's very high turnover of spaces. There's nearly always stuff sitting empty, but that stuff is also usually in relatively good condition. When you look in places like Swansea, a lot of the stuff that's been sat empty is often not in very good condition. And so meanwhile space is not a substitute for dereliction. So if a building is derelict, it's too expensive to put it right for a short-term use. But if the building is generally structurally sound, you know, there's no water pouring through the roof, you know, it's the walls are all intact, it's not going to fall down, but it's kind of a bit grotty, or it's been empty for sort of 2 years, so you think, well, it's probably okay, but I wouldn't fancy plugging into something into one of the sockets or whatever without testing it. It's what's called compliance costs. In other words, it's what you need to do to make a space safe to go into, which is usually testing and fixing the electrics, maybe putting testing and replacing the fire alarm if there is a fire alarm in there. It might be that there's no loo in there, or if there is a loo in there, it's pretty horrible and unbeen used for 5 years, or, you know, the water system has been stagnant for 5 years, so you don't really want to drink anything that comes out of it, so the pipes need replacing. It might be there's a few holes in the stud walling. It might be that there's broken glass on the window, or that the locks need replacing. It's those types of things which, again, if you're taking out a 10-year lease, are relatively modest costs, you'll recover them. But if you're only taking out 3 to 6 months, it might be 4 or 5 grand's worth of cost, and you're just not going to recover that. So one of the things we've got tied to the meanwhile lease is a small pot of money where we can effectively grant fund modest amounts of work when you go into a space. To make life easy, what we're doing with most of these spaces is we've created a non-profit umbrella company, like we've done with the Markets project. That is taking out the leases on the spaces, and it's doing the works itself, because it's just quicker and easier to do it that way rather than dealing with multiple people making grant claims. And then what we've created under that is a sub-license. So effectively we hold the lease with the landlord, and then there's a much simpler form of license for the space, which then goes to the end users. Having said that, the PopUpWales project can be used if you want to make a direct relationship with a landlord where you hold the lease with the landlord. So it can be done that way if you want to do it. And what you do then is you just download the standard template lease and you do the negotiation with the landlord yourself. So there's 2 different ways of doing it. But what we're trying to do with the pilot with PopUpWales is to try almost to create kind of a standardized approach to the whole process, to try and make it as easy as possible effectively. The third area then, which is the reason for us doing the pilot and trying to build a bit of scale with this at the moment, that's the bit we're doing right now, is that in this part of the world, it's just not a very well-known approach with landlords. So they're familiar with it, a lot of them, with things like charity shops, but a lot of them don't want charity shops because they sort of feel like it, you know, they've got nothing against charity shops, but you know, some landlords will sort of feel like, oh, it kind of maybe draws down the feeling of value of the building if it's a charity shop. So you can do charity shops as pop-ups, and that's effectively what charity shops are. They are effectively meanwhile spaces for charities, but it's a particular niche of meanwhile. But there's nothing to say that in doing a meanwhile space, it can't be something which has got quite a slick looking finish to it. You know, it can be nicely done. You can do a, you can work wonders with a bit of stud walling and a couple of pots of paint, you know, to make a space look nice and dress it. And for those of you who are market traders, you will know this already. You know, you're very used to making a point of sale look really good in the space of an hour, because when you're in a market, that's the only time you've got to set something up, and you'll know, you will spot when you do markets. And actually, if any of you are on this call who are not market traders, it's worth wandering around a market and you'll spot the ones who are really good at it, because they can make their points of sale look beautiful, but it's literally a trestle table and a bit of cloth and stuff that's been shoved in the boot of a car, which, you know, which they've got to set up in an hour or so at the beginning and take it all down again at the end. And meanwhile space is a kind of a similar principle to that, is you can use that sort of pop-up thing. Obviously with a meanwhile space, instead of having it for a day, you might have it for a couple of weeks or for a couple of months, so you can spend a bit more time. But it's the same sort of principle. Is what you're doing is effectively you're dressing it, you're making it look temporarily interesting and useful. There are some things which are more difficult in meanwhile spaces. So if you require preparation of food, that's harder to do in a meanwhile space because of all the food hygiene stuff you've got to do and setting up kitchens and the costs of setting up kitchens. That is a very difficult thing to do when you've only got a space for 3 to 6 months. So you can do it, because sometimes the thing that's become vacant was formerly a hospitality venue, so it might still have kitchens and extractor fans and, you know, all the things that you need for that, in which case you can do a meanwhile because it's already there. But if you go into a space that was perhaps previously a shop, so therefore there's no kitchen space, there's no extraction, etc., the electric supply maybe isn't good enough for running, you know, what you need for a kitchen, that can be a bit trickier when you're doing a meanwhile space, just because of the short nature. But there are ways around that where you can still cook and prepare food off-site, and you can use a meanwhile space as a point of sale, or you just use your meanwhile space to heat the food up, but you're not preparing it on site. Certain foods you don't need the full shebang of, you know, extraction systems, etc., so it is more viable. I've mentioned that derelict properties are probably a no-no. They're not worth doing as meanwhile spaces because the costs of bringing them back into use are just not worth it for short term. And similarly, there are some things which, some spaces where even if they're in good nick, they're just not very easy to convert. So particularly things that were formerly banks, because they're built like fortresses, you know, you can't quickly adapt them into those sorts of spaces because they're, you know, they're designed not to allow you to do that, because they're designed to stop someone driving a van through the window or whatever. So it's very expensive to make even quite basic changes. So there are some exceptions, but broadly, the idea is that it's quick, fast, light and cheap. So what we've done so far with it is, as well as the ones we've done ourselves in the past, we've done a pilot of 4 spaces, one of which we set up ourselves, so we could test it ourselves to make sure that it worked, which is the former Tapestry Cafe in the old police station in Swansea, which will be opening, hopefully, COVID permitting, the week after next. And we've also then done 3 spaces in the Quadrant Centre, which are 3 of the units in there, which are the former Game, which I showed you, the little kiosk opposite, and we're just about to take on the former Disney store, and maybe the former Thornton's unit, but I think that one will be very short paced because I think somebody's going to want that fairly soon, for a long-term let. But what we're now in the process of doing, which I said that was the pilot, and so we're just now turning the pilot into it's still a kind of pilot, but it's sort of an expanded pilot. So we're now looking at taking on a further 10 spaces, and that's what I'm in the midst of doing right now. So we started that in the week or 2 before Christmas and followed it up last week and this week. So we're in contact with lots of landlords and agents to look at bringing on spaces. So we're hoping we'll have those in place sort of February time. So we already have a couple of the units in the Quadrant. As you can imagine, we've got quite a lot of demand for them as well. But, you know, do let us know if any of those would be of interest to you. The nature of meanwhile space is quick. So it's not the sort of thing of thinking, well, I'd quite like it in 3 months' time, because we don't know if we'll have them in 3 months' time. They're the sort of thing of saying, I'd like it next week, or I'd like it in a couple of weeks' time. It's that sort of time scale. So if you've got the sort of project where you need quite long lead-in times to take spaces on, meanwhile might not be for you. But that's the basic premise of what meanwhile is as a process. So happy to answer any questions you've got on meanwhile spaces, and you can have a look at the PopUpWales website. There is also on there a guide which since I took this screen grab, actually, I've just realised I should update that, because there's now another tab at the top of the page which says, guide, which basically is like both for landlords but also for end users of Meanwhile Spaces, a guide on Meanwhile Spaces. So if you just want to do it for yourself rather than go through PopUpWales, you can just read the guide and just have a go at it yourself, sort of thing. There's a long form version of the guide if you really want to go down the rabbit hole with it, but there's also a short form version of it which gives you the basics. They both basically tell you the same thing. One just goes into more detail, but they're both on there. They're free. You can go on. PopUpWales, in order to register with it, is completely free. Both for landlords and for for tenants, if they just want to register on there. If you take on a space, it depends on the individual spaces. Some might be free, some might have a nominal charge on them, but as I say, it's always low cost. If there is a charge on them, it's effectively equivalent to a service charge. The only time it gets a little bit more for a per day cost is if you literally want it for a day or 2 days. Then you might find it's almost like the equivalent of, say, renting a market pitch or something like that, where it might be 50 or 60 quid for a day, because the cost to the landlord or the person of opening it just for 1 day is they're not going to give you the keys. It means they've got to come physically open it up, let you in, and then come back at the end of the day and lock it all up again. It's just a bit more costly. Whereas if you take on something for 2 months, you will sign a license, they will give you the keys, and then there's actually less work for them. So the per day cost is much lower if you're in for 2 or 3 months, or sometimes 2 or 3 weeks. Some places might have a service charge. So if they're dealing with all the refuse for you, for example, and they might say, well, there's a charge for dealing with that, or if there's lifts or escalators and that sort of stuff that has to be maintained, they might make a nominal charge, but it's a lot lower than if you're going at a commercial rent, basically. It's very rare it would be more than the equivalent of 50 or 60 quid a day. And if you're taking something for several weeks, occasionally they are free. But if there is a charge, it's a very modest charge, and it can be done on a per day or a per week basis. So it's ultra flexible. So that's kind of pop-ups, and that's sort of in a nutshell on that. Then I'm just going to give you sort of just a couple of bullet points then of some of the stuff, in general terms about sort of taking on premises and, taking on your first sort of building. And again, bearing in mind, this is very much catering towards and assuming that you're at the beginning of that journey. Okay, so if you're experienced at having spaces, some of this will feel highly patronizing. But I'm assuming that most of you either have never had a premises before, or have only had very basic sort of understanding of kind of that whole process. So the first thing, and this goes for everything you do in business, not just whether you take on a license for a premises, but it's a thing that a lot of people often forget, because a lot of us get into business because we enjoy something or we feel like we're good at something. And that's perfectly valid as a reason for getting into business. But it's always remind yourself of the fact that every business across the world, whether you're Apple or Coca-Cola, or whether you're guys just starting off, everything is driven by your market. It's the people who buy your product inform everything you do. And you probably know that instinctively, you might not have written it down, but the same is true of premises. So always think about who is my audience and why would I be in this location? So it's always driven by your audience. So if your what you do requires pass by trade, if you're opening something as a retail establishment, or if it's a hospitality business or whatever it means, where it requires pass by custom, you might have an element of online sales to it, but nevertheless you're doing it because you want a shop front, then you have to really think about footfall. Now, going to the Meanwhile space, there's a degree with Meanwhile spaces where you can't be that choosy, because they are where they are and you sort of take it or leave it. When you're just doing it purely commercially in the market and you're just saying, well, I'll take any space actually because I want to look for it, you need to be looking for, well, what is best for my business? There are things that temper that further down the line, which I'll come to in a minute. But first and foremost, it's what is the location that's going to be best for me, for my business. And so you have to think about things like footfall. And footfall is something which is highly sensitive. Okay, so you will see sometimes, and some economic development people still think in terms of what used to be called anchor store theory. All right, so the idea of anchor store theory is if you put Debenhams in a place where there's no footfall, it will generate footfall. Now, occasionally it's true, right? But they're the exceptions to the rule. The rule is that business follows footfall, not the other way around, always. Okay, there's very rare exceptions, right? So if you are a Michelin star chef, people will probably find you wherever you are if you market yourself well enough. But you have to be at the absolute top of your game and exceptionally good at marketing yourself for that to work. In most instances, Business goes where the footfall is, not the other way around. It's incredibly difficult to manufacture the process the other way around. So the way to remember that is, you think of any movie you've ever watched where you see the inn at the crossroads. Why is the inn at the crossroads? The crossroads didn't go there because the inn was there. The inn went there because the crossroads is there, because it's where the people meet, and that's where the footfall is. And that's the thing to remember with business. That's been true for centuries. It's still true now if you have a physical point of sale that relies on pass by trade. So that's the thing to remember with it. And footfall is incredibly sensitive, even very, very short distances. So as a few of you are fairly familiar with the Uplands, where we do the Uplands market, I'll use Uplands as an example. Uplands is what, maybe 400 meters long from the start of the shopping parade to the end of the shopping parade, roughly, something like that. The units at either end of it really struggle, and Uplands is thriving. Uplands is doing really, really well. It's about as good as it gets in terms of kind of a suburban sort of shopping parade, in terms of, you can see the rental levels, they're high, etc., etc. But if you look at both ends of it, the top end's doing a little bit better, but the bottom end of it is, there's two long-term empty units there, and at the top end, there's been a bit of turnover of the units up there, and that's the difference of, a few hundred meters, above 100 meters, really, 150 meters to the middle, where footfall is incredibly strong. And so that shows you in a microcosm how quickly footfall can drop off in a space. So it's really important to think about footfall if you're thinking about a point of sale. Where's footfall at the strongest? It's where the two roads meet. And remember, roads aren't just about cars, they're about pedestrians. That's where pedestrians meet as well, the cyclists and everybody else. Because yes, don't get too dragged into a discussion about parking, all right? Because you cannot get enough parking in an urban area. It's impossible, you just can't do it. So really, you've got to think about that. Even if people do go there in their cars, at some point they get out of their car and they have to move around. All right, you can't park your car right in front of a shop. It's almost unheard of. Very occasionally you're lucky, but normally the only space in front of a shop, you can get one car there, and that's, once that space is gone, it's gone. So you've got to think about pedestrian footfall and where that goes. So location, 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 always think about that. Of course, some of you might not be wanting a space where it's about point of sale. You might want a space for offices, you might want a space for production, you might want a space for other things. And there you need to think almost in the opposite, which is, well, there is a premium, putting meanwhile spaces aside for a minute, there is a premium that is paid in the market for being in front of footfall. So therefore it's more expensive. Where if you don't need the footfall, you might locate somewhere where a little bit further away from that, because the market is going to dictate that will be cheaper. And that's how the market works in those sorts of terms. It's been a bit disrupted now because of online sales and all those sorts of things, but that's the way it works. Secondly, is type and tenure. So meanwhile space are about as short as you can get. So there's the type of premises. Is it a ground floor unit? Is it ground floor with upstairs? Is it upstairs only? Is it a basement or whatever it is? Is it a warehouse? Whatever it is, that's the type. And then tenure is how long you get in that space. So you're going to have it as a meanwhile, ultra short term. You're going to take out a lease for a couple of years. You're going to take out a lease for 10 years, 20 years, whatever it might be. Then you've got to start thinking about cost and risk. So obviously you'll see on an estate agent's board, and you'll go online and you'll find out what it's there. And that's where you have to start then weighing up. And that's where your business plan comes in and saying, okay, well, it's on the market for X amount of money. Is that something that is viable in relation to my likely turnover as a business? Now, as you probably all know, you'll write a business plan. You do your best to kind of work out as far as possible, is that going to work or not? But there's, to a certain degree, you don't really know until you try it. And so what you've got to do is try and minimize the unknowns in that. There's always be a bit of an unknown in that process until you actually try it. But that's all about then thinking about, well, what are the risks to me? What are the process? That's where you might think about a meanwhile space. And so you'd weigh up things about, well, how much is it going to cost me to outfit the space? How much is it going to cost to rent the space? What are the risks that if it doesn't work, then I'm tied into a long lease where I'm going to have to carry on paying that lease whether I'm trading or not? How long can I give myself until I have a break point? And a lot of that then comes into how you negotiate with a landlord to say, well, might do this, might do that, or shall I take a meanwhile space so I can test it? I'm not very sure of it. On the other hand, you might say, well, I don't want a meanwhile space because I'm actually really confident in my business model. I don't want something really short term. I want some security. I want to know that if I'm going to invest some money in the space, I've got it for at least 2 or 3 years. I've got that security of tenure or whatever it might be. You can put in things like break clauses into leases. So you might take a 5-year lease, but you have a break after 18 months or 2 years that says I can give notice at that point if it's not working or whatever. They're not usually meanwhile spaces at that point, but they are, at that point, the landlord might then negotiate, say, well, okay, but I want you to opt out of the Landlord Tenant Act. And that's a negotiation. That's where you need solicitors and lawyers to come in. There are 3 broad ways you can get property. You can license it, which is the lowest security for you, but is the maximum flexibility. And that's what I was describing we use under the meanwhile process. You can have a lease, which gives you a bit more security. It's not your premises in that you can't mortgage it because it's not yours, but you've got some security of tenure, and they can be of very long leases, they can be very short, they can be whatever you want. That's a negotiation with the landlord. Or you can buy your premises, you can buy the freehold like you would with a house or whatever it might be, and then it's yours to do what you want with. What your business is needs to dictate which one you do. It would be rare for a startup to buy a premises unless their business is letting out spaces, but you can do that. There are things you can do that, and there is grant around at the moment, which Stephen his colleagues can tell you about. You can bring in a chartered surveyor. Chartered surveyors know lots about property. They'll know the market. They will understand pricing. They will be able to give you advice. Obviously, there's cost of professional fees there, but you may well find that you more than make your money back on what you cost them, because they will help you go in and negotiate a good rent that is in line with what the market is currently paying. Bear in mind that an estate agent is always acting in the interests of their client, who's the landlord, so they will always try to get the top dollar, whereas a chartered surveyor will be able to come in and give you a sort of sense of, well, actually that's probably a bit over the odds, or no, that's about right. Then you'll need to think about legals. So obviously in the meanwhile space, we've kind of done that work for you, but if you're taking a space of your own, you'll probably have bespoke legals. They will cost you a bit more. A standard price for legals is about 1,500 quid. If it's not too complicated, that's the sort of rough rule of thumb of the sort of money that you're looking at for legals. You'll need to do your due diligence on things like conditions. You need things like surveys. So, don't go into spaces and just, oh yeah, this looks nice, it's in a nice place, like you would if you were buying a house. Always apply the same principles. Get somebody who's a builder to go with you, or get someone who's an architect, or whatever it might be. It's worth the money to find out if there's anything to be worried about. You don't want to go into a space and all of a sudden then you've signed a lease and you find out it's riddled with asbestos, or it's falling down, or all of a sudden you're the one then who has to put all of that right. There's a lot you can do with landlords to negotiate those things. So if places are not in good condition, you can go in and say, well, you've got to put this right, but if you do put it right, then I will pay you X. Or you can say, well, it's not in great condition, so I want a rent-free period. So there's a lot you can negotiate on those things. You don't have to go in on day one and start paying 20 grand a year rent or whatever it might be. You can go in and say, well, look, I'm gonna be spending £10,000 doing the space up, so I want a year's rent free, or I want 2 years rent free. One of the things you've got in your interest at the moment is that it is a buyer's market right now for property, because the market is so flat at the moment. It will probably recover a bit quicker, and I think some people said it would, but right now it's very volatile. It's up, it's down, it's there's a lot of people who might not survive, and etc. So now is quite a good time to be doing deals with people. They might not want to commit to the long term because of the uncertainty, but it's not a bad time to be doing deals. Look at the market conditions as part of that. Don't just sign for what's on there. Part of property is you haggle. You look at kind of, well, what is a reasonable amount for this? Sometimes if you really want a space, if it's the perfect space, yeah, you might get £1,000 off. But is it worth the risk of doing that? If you think this is the perfect place for me, you might want to think, actually, it's worth paying maybe slightly more than I could get it for, but I'm getting the perfect venue. There isn't like a right or a wrong to that. You'll be able to decide that, as you'll know your business better than I do. And there is a fair amount of dark art to this. It's kind of like there aren't specific rights and wrongs. You kind of some of it is about negotiating and seeing how you do it. And if you're not good at that, get somebody who is to kind of be part of that process with you. As I say, there are grants and support around. There's then a whole range of sort of legal and licensing stuff you've also got to bear in mind, depending what you do as a business. So if you're selling alcohol, there's a whole range of licensing things that come in with it. If you're doing anything which is retail space and you're taking a shop, the planning is probably going to allow that type of use. You can quite easily flip things between A1 and A3 uses. So A1 is retail type uses, A3 are hospitality type uses. But bearing in mind that things like alcohol license are separate to the planning conditions that come on it. So just flipping something to an A3 license doesn't guarantee that you'll get an alcohol license on it. So bear in mind there are other regulatory things based on your line of work that you may have to do. If you're a clothes shop, it's a bit lighter touch. If you're selling food or alcohol, there's more regulatory licensing things that you've got to go through. Probably you'll be familiar, if you're already operating but not in premises, you'll probably be already familiar with a lot of that sort of stuff anyway, because you're probably having to do it now anyway. It's just that you might have to do a bit more of it. So that's kind of, I've gone through it in a bit of a whirlwind. It's a big topic to cover in an hour and a half, but I want to make sure that we had at least half an hour for sort of questions in the process. But the final thing I'll just finish with is what you can do is don't just look at one premises. So if you're looking, if you see and you think this is perfect, fine, go for it. But usually what you do with premises is draw up a little short list for yourself. And what you can do with that is what's called an options appraisal. And an options appraisal sounds like a really complicated thing, but basically you can just do like a strengths and weaknesses kind of, assessment of what it is. What's good about it, what's not so good about it. So, and that can be quite basic things. What's good about it is in great footfall area. What's not so good about it? Well, the land wants a lot of money and it's not in very good condition. And there seem to have been lots of businesses that have tried it over the years and none of them seem to have worked, or whatever it might be. So they can be quite simple things. They don't have to be complicated technical things. They're things you're perfectly capable of doing yourself. And if you're not sure, ask for advice, ask people to sort of know more about this sort of stuff. First thing to do with that always in anything in business, whether it's leases and licenses or whether it's other things that you do, is, draw on your own networks. If you've got a friend who's an architect or a builder or whatever, draw on them. So, if you're opening a cafe, say, well, can you do me a freebie? And there'll be free coffees for you or whatever it is. If you'll just give me some advice before I get going, they're not going to do 20 grand's worth of work for you for that, but they might just come along and just have a quick look at it for you. And they'll spot very quickly there's cracks in some of the supporting masonry. Therefore, be very careful. That might mean there's subsidence or whatever. They're things that you wouldn't notice maybe as a lay person. But there may be certain things that you do have to commission somebody with a specialist bit of knowledge. Be careful whose advice you buy. Do a bit of due diligence. Make sure they know what they're talking about, that they've got a bit of track record, that they come with some recommendations. Again, there's a lot of advice and support around, a lot of it free. There's Business Wales, there's the council, there's a lot of free advice and support around, so do use it. And I think that's probably enough for now. I'll draw a line there. There's lots of other things I could do, but I wanted to allow a bit of time for questions. So I think I'll finish there. I'm going to turn my thing off so I can see everybody, and make my screen bigger. So that's just a bit of a whirlwind introduction to it. So over to you, really, if you want to ask some questions. I think there's a hands up function, but there's probably not that many on the call, so don't worry if you can't find it. And if you all overlap each other, I'll just pick one to go, and then the other one can wait their turn.
Yeah, guys, put your hands up if you want to ask a question. Now we've had Distill and Phil put a question in the chat here. Are you in contact with Swansea Licensing with regards to quickly licensing a space, or would it all rely on temporary events notices? Okay,
so that's a very good question. So one of the ones I missed off, as well as the, if you're preparing food, is alcohol licensing. And as you know, alcohol licensing is, along with business rates, is one of the least flexible areas around the meanwhile space uses. So you can do things with TENS licenses, as you're aware, which enable you to have, and you don't have to have single day on TENS. You can extend TENS over several days, but there is a limit of it. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. I think it's 5 days. So where we've done it in the past with that, that's what we've done, is we've done a series of TENS. But you can do, if there's already a license on the premises, then if you've already got your DPS, then transferring that license over is a relatively swift process if the license already exists for that premises. If there is no licensed premises, and that's one of the things we're working through at the moment, is how rapidly can that be done? One of the problems we've got at the moment is that even in ideal circumstances, some of these things take a while, but on top of ideal circumstances, obviously we don't have ideal circumstances at the moment, where you've got local authority offices and departments, one, who are decimated by people being off sick with COVID, which is, at the moment is nearing its peak. And secondly, is that even if they are all full complement and fit and healthy, is that they might also be doing 10 other things which are not normally part of their job because there's so much disruption related to COVID. And so it is taking a bit longer, and that's one of the tensions we're working through at the moment, is how can we make this fast enough to make it work for as wide a range of users as possible. But also there are certain regulatory things you just cannot get around. Some of the licensing regulation is there for very good reason, to stop people doing unscrupulous things. Not that I'm sure anybody on this call would do anything unscrupulous, but there are people who will do unscrupulous things. So there are some certain minimum periods where you just cannot get around it. But you can still, with meanwhile, still sort of say, factor that in, is to say, well, okay, it is going to take us a minimum of 6 weeks to get, or whatever it might be, to get ourselves a license in place. Therefore, we are going to want that meanwhile space for a minimum of 3 or 4 months, because the first 6 weeks of this is almost a write-off. And so, there's ways in which we can sort of construct those sorts of things. Or you might do a deal to sort of say, well, we want to go in, we don't want to be liable for any empty business rates, so therefore we're going to want to go in and we'll get somebody else in there for the first 6 weeks of our tenancy, where they can use it as a pop-up gallery for 4 weeks of it. Then we'll have 2 weeks of it to do it up, and then we can go on, but it means we've secured it in the meantime, and you're effectively sub-licensing it to a third party who maybe gives you 20 quid a day or whatever it is to run an art gallery in there or whatever. So there's other ways you could construct that type of thing. One thing I forgot to mention, sorry, because I was going through it quickly, is that business rates are payable in meanwhile spaces. So at the moment, business rates are relaxed for retail, leisure and hospitality anyway. So there's 100% relief on business rates until the 31st of March anyway, if you're in that sector. But obviously, we're running out of time on that period now. Welsh Government are going to give they're not going to give 100% relief, but they're going to give 50% relief on retail, leisure and hospitality from the 1st of April onwards. And as far as I know, that's for the full year. But nevertheless, rates are still payable. Now, if you're, say, doing a pop-up space in Gorseinon, or at the top of High Street, the business rates are going to be fairly modest anyway. If you want to do a pop-up space in the Quadrant, you do need to factor that in because the business rates on a unit in the Quadrant are eye-watering. They're very, very high. Now, you're removing rent, so you are still operating at a much, much lower level, but you do have to think about that as a use if you're doing something, say, in the Quadrant or something like that, whether that is the peak land value, that's the highest level. Rates are related, directly proportionate to the rateable value, which is in turn basically based on the notional market rent. In other words, what in theory is that building worth in rental terms? That doesn't necessarily mean that's what you actually pay in rent, because you might negotiate your rent with a landlord or whatever, but rates are based on a rateable value, which is, all other things being equal, this is what this premises would be leased for. That is renewed every couple of years, and I think the next rate review is next year. I expect at that point the rateable value will probably plummet unless the economy very strongly recovers. Might happen, but nobody really knows. But probably the rateable value will go down, but don't assume that the rates will necessarily go down, because there's a thing called the multiplier with rates, which is a fraction which the overall rateable value is multiplied by. At the moment it's 0.53. Okay, so it's roughly half. And so if a property's on for 20 grand as a rateable value, you're going to pay roughly 10 grand a year in rates on it. Slightly over because it's 0.53, but it's roughly half if you're doing a rough rule of thumb. And what will probably happen is if the rateable value drops, they'll increase the multiplier so that the rates, because ultimately that's a big chunk of Welsh Government's taxation, so they can't afford to lose it. So they probably will balance that out. There are other reliefs. So you can get, if the rateable value at the moment, this might change, but at the moment, if the rateable value is 6 grand or less, then you get 100% relief anyway, regardless of COVID. And if the rateable value, and I've never done one with this because I've never done a premises that was that low in value, but if the rateable value is 2 grand or less, I think it's permanently free. You would have to check on that because I've never done one at that lower level. It's not often you find stuff that's that cheap. They're normally out in the middle of nowhere or whatever, but there are other releases. That's normally, you can find it on government websites. You know, it's fairly straightforward. So that's one thing I forgot to mention going through it quickly, is that business rates are payable. But bear in mind at the moment, you've got a very narrow window because 31st of March isn't that far away now, but they are free at the moment because of COVID.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Diana, I saw you put your hand up. Have you got a question?
Don't forget you're muted, Diana.
Yeah, don't get you mute.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I got to be honest, I think you've answered everything, but I didn't catch the name of your company, like Urban, and then I didn't write the other thing down.
That's fine. Urban Foundry is the name of the company, but if you're interested in the meanwhile space, it's got its own website, which is PopUpWales.com. But Urban Foundry is the name of the umbrella company, and some of the other things we run them as sort of spin-out companies, of which PopUpWales is part of a spin-out company. The markets are a spin-out company. So what we do, Urban Foundry sets them up, spins them out. So we, with the very little ones like PopUpWales and the markets, Urban Foundry still administers them because as individual entities, they're too small to take on staff. But they are essentially separate organisations. So, but PopUpWales is the one for .com is the one for the meanwhile space.
Okay. The other thing I was going to, I'm with Business Wales. In fact, Howard is my what's it called? Howard. So, but I've got a couple of things down here, but I think more or less you've answered them. Is there a maximum time with you? If I went to a pop-up, would there be a maximum time you can like go through you to have that space?
Not really. That comes down to a negotiation with the landlord, but bear in mind that any meanwhile space, it's unusual that the landlord would accept anything longer than a 3-month rolling notice. So even if you did go in and sign a 5-year lease, you can do that. We've done that on premises, but within that lease, you've always only got a 3-month rolling notice period. So you've got to assume that in theory, you could be in there and not have to renegotiate your terms for 5 years, but at any point they can give you 3 months notice. Ones that need a lot of work, we have done 1 or 2. It's quite hard to do, but we have done 1 or 2 where we've negotiated 6 months secure, and then 3 months rolling notice kicking in after those 6 months. But that's only really, we've only ever done that really on 2 of them. And in both of those instances, it was because the premises needed a lot of work. And in those 2 instances, they were a level of work that normally I wouldn't have done as a meanwhile space. They just happened. One was the Unit 19 space, where it was a lot of money, but because of the nature of what we were doing, we thought we could make it back quite quickly. It was a bit of a gamble, but we did make it back. And the other one was because the university was a partner, which was that pop-up space that I showed you with the university, where the university had deep enough pockets that they weren't too concerned about the level of risk that was involved. They could just do that quite quickly. But normally retail, meanwhile, are very short, kind of 3 months turnaround sort of spaces. So they're not a solution for if you want security. And even if you do negotiate that slightly longer one, you still usually, you will always have to opt out of the Landlord and Tenant Act, which it doesn't really give you any security of tenure. So if what you want is stability, meanwhile isn't for you. You're probably past the stage where meanwhile is a thing for you. You want to actually do a direct negotiation with the landlord, where you might use the meanwhile lease as a template and change bits of it, but you wouldn't need then a lawyer to do it. But so there's nothing to say that you couldn't do that. And one of the things you can do with the meanwhile space, and it's sort of, we've made it open source so anybody can take it and do what they want with it, but is to have a process where you might have a lawyer who just takes bits of it, so it still makes it cheaper, and it's designed to be relatively non-controversial. It's to put a reasonable degree of onus on the end user. You've still got to be sensible. You've got to give the space back effectively in the condition in which you received it, but you don't have to do anything more than that. It has to be clean and tidy, and if you do make changes to it, you've got to take those changes away if the landlord asks you to by the end of it. Usually, actually, in meanwhile spaces, you've usually improved the space. So quite often the landlord sort of says, well, actually leave it like that because it's nicer than it was before we gave it to you. But sometimes they do say, no, you need to strip everything out and take it back to scratch. But it depends on the nature of the space and what you've done to it. Basically, certainly if you put on signage or vinyls on the windows or painted it, normally they will either require you to return it to a neutral colour scheme or the original colour scheme. And certainly they will want you to do things like take vinyls off windows and take signage down and things like that, so that when you give it back, that you're giving it back as effectively a blank canvas. Normally what you do with that is what we call a scheduler condition, which is basically you take a load of photos of the space of what it's like when it starts. You agree with the landlord, this is, a representation of what it looks like. And that forms part then of the license or the lease that says you've both got photographic evidence. You can go back to say, no, there was a hole in that when we first took it on, so therefore we don't have to repair it or whatever it might be.
Right, okay. I haven't got a clue what kind of unit I want. That's another thing. Do you mean as I've never done this before? My idea of my business is going to be a floristry warehouse, like a floristry wholesaler. So I'll need like rows, if you get what I mean, in places where I can store like stock stuff really, more than anything else. So obviously I'll have to get the shelving and whatever in there. And obviously, I haven't got a clue it's going to work or not. There's no one in Wales. That's one good thing I know, because
one of the things you could think about with that is that it sounds like it's more of a, if you don't need a point of sale, it might be more of a warehousey type thing. And warehouses have probably been a bit more resilient to the current COVID climate because the nature of what you tend to do in a warehouse is less reliant on footfall, which is the thing.
I was thinking of doing like online first, obviously, because of COVID. I want to open it up to the public.
Yeah, the other thing you could think of is there may be somebody who's got a warehouse unit, but they're not using 100% of the space. And so what you could use the meanwhile for is you could use the license bit of the meanwhile to say, well, provided their lease with their own landlord allows them to do that, which they might be prohibited from subletting, in which case you might not be able to do it, but that's for them to decide on that. But you could use the meanwhile license to say, well, look, could you do a deal with me where I can have a corner of your space that you're not using just for 3 months, so I try this out.
Yeah.
You'd have to decide about, do you trust them, because obviously there's an open access space and they might be able to get at your stuff and things like that. But that might be a way of trialing without taking a space on for yourself, but sort of do a deal with somebody who's maybe got a great big unit. I mean, you can sometimes find them. So I think they're fully occupied at the moment, but there was a meanwhile space done in the old Toys R Us before Aldi took it down in Park Towie, and that was used by Circus Eruption. They're a circus project, and I mean they were using like literally one corner of this cavernous space, But that was a meanwhile space. It wasn't one we did. It was one they just did directly. But that was a meanwhile project. So you can sometimes find them, in little retail parks where there's just stuff that's just been sat empty for ages. And that's a good starting point with a landlord. Is you can go and talk to the people next door and just say, how long has the space next door been empty? And if they tell you it's been empty for 6 months, then you might have a negotiating position. But if it's been empty for 5 years, clearly it's a problem for the landlord, and they're probably spending a lot of money on empty business rates. So there's probably a deal to be done on on those sorts of spaces.
Okay. And then the other one then I was going to say is, how on earth do I find one? Because but I think you've more or less answered that.
Yeah, so once we're past the pilot stage,
drove around. You can't drive around all day every day looking for a
you can't do, but you can go on. There's two things to have a look at. One is that the local authority maintains a vacant property register, which is on its website. So go onto Swansea Council's website, use the search function. I think all local authorities do it. So if you're outside of Swansea working with people with Business Wales, I think other local authorities do it, but certainly Swansea do. And that's compiled. It's not always bang up to date because I think it's renewed like every 6 months. So obviously if something's let during that 6 months, it looks like it's vacant on the register, but it isn't. But that's a good starting point because they cover industrial, retail. I think they also cover land for sale on it as well.
Sorry to interrupt you. Swansea Council website. What did you say then?
And just go in the search function and search for vacant property register, I think it's called. I mean, I'm sure Steve will be able to find it if you can't find it when you search, but you should find it straight away. And that they do that in the, they keep that up to date I can't remember if it's every year or every 6 months, certainly every year that's kept up to date. And that just lists all where they know who the agent is. Normally they'll put down the name of the agent, the letting agent on it, which saves you a bit of homework. Sometimes the council also doesn't know who the letting agent is, but where they do know, they list that in the register, and that's a good starting point. And the other thing you can do is just trawl the websites of the local estate agents, because most of them have got them all listed on that, and you can search on their websites: empty retail, empty warehouses, empty industrial. Sometimes they're not called warehouses, they might be under a category of something like industrial or something like that, but it doesn't necessarily mean the use has to be industrial. It's just a loose umbrella definition for things like warehouses, basically, is an industrial usage. But that's the start point I would go with, and that's what, if I was looking for premises. You're right that sometimes there's no substitute for literally just go and have a wander around the town centre. We're not London. You can cover all of town centre in Swansea in half a day. If you wander around, you can literally wander around with a little notebook and note down what's empty.
I'm thinking I've got like more what I would rather is like a industrial estate.
Yeah, or you could have a little private enterprise zone. The enterprise zone is harder because there's all sorts of cul-de-sacs and dead ends. It's quite hard to find your way around. But equally so, if you know somebody up there, the other thing you will find is that certain estate agents specialise more in certain things. Some are everything, but some tend to do more of one type of thing. Another, you might well find that there's one estate agent that deals mainly with retail, within retail park type spaces. So you don't necessarily have to go to every single one. You might find one that's got a lot of those types of premises on its website, and that gives you a head start. But start with a vacant property register from the council, because that's a good starting point just to take a look at. And remember, it's not just the enterprise zone. There's little tucked away bits of sort of mini industrial estates. Like there's a little.
That's what I would rather have, to be honest with you.
There's one on.
I got to be honest, I'm from Bridgend. I live in Swansea now, but I'm originally from Bridgend. So if you ask me about Bridgend, I could tell you everywhere. But of course, I'm around you, I haven't got a clue, to be honest.
Bridgend are also about to pilot a meanwhile space in Bridgend as well. They're a bit behind the Swansea one, but that's going to be on tap around about May time. So they've just advertised for the tender now, which we're in the middle of bidding for. So it may be us doing it, maybe somebody else. I don't know. It depends if we win the tender. But but they are, somebody will be running that type of project for Bridgend as well. So have a look there.
Okay. All right. Lovely. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay. Babita, see your hand.
Babita, see your hand up there.
Hello. Don't forget your penny in the jar.
Sorry. Just wanted to ask, are all these meanwhile spaces in the city centre, or is it that one would go and find a space, then come to Urban Foundry or pop up?
You can do a meanwhile space as a concept. A meanwhile space can happen anywhere, doesn't it? As a concept. In terms of what we currently have funding to do, then we are restricted to town centre, and we've got them up and running in town centre because I did the first stage of the pilot was smaller, and that was town centre only, so we've already got some in the town centre. The second stage of the pilot allows us to do town centre, but also the second tier ones I mentioned, so that's Mumble, Sketty, Gosainen, Pontedilais, Gowerton. Uplands is excluded because Uplands is just fine. It doesn't really need meanwhile spaces. It's commercially, it's doing perfectly well. That doesn't mean that you couldn't do a meanwhile space in uplands. It just means that we can't use the funding for a meanwhile space in uplands. So if you want to look at one in uplands, by all means give me a ring, but I can't do lots of work on it for you, but but we can certainly have a chat about it. And you can still use the meanwhile template and the meanwhile guide because they're open source. They're just on the website. They've been paid for. They're just there. You'll find the meanwhile lease, by the way, that isn't on the website, mainly because I don't want to scupper anybody who writes leases for a living just by putting it for free on a website. So you have to register, but once you've registered, you can then ask us, can you send me the meanwhile lease? And we'll just send it to you then. And in that will be say, please don't post this online, but you can use it for your own purposes, because it's not very fair for solicitors to do that for a living, just to say here it is for free for anybody in the world to download it, because it's been publicly funded. But if you register on the website, we will email it to you. But the guide is on there for anybody to access, because that doesn't really, scupper anybody. That doesn't distort the market in any way. But yeah, you can in theory do one anywhere, so you can use the same principles anywhere. But if you want to tap into the funding, there's set locations for that.
So just to clarify, I would go out and find a premises somewhere, say, I don't know, Sketty or somewhere, and then come to
we can help then with making it a meanwhile, either by just giving you advice where you just do it directly, or we can take it on as a meanwhile space directly ourselves with a non-profit, which is kind of the way the markets work. There's an umbrella non-profit that does the deal. In the case of the markets, is with the local authority, and then just lets the spaces to try and make it easy, basically. And the same principle with a meanwhile space, but there's nothing to say you couldn't just do the deal direct with a landlord and just use us for advice. You can do it either way.
Right. Okay, great. Yeah, lovely. That's just...
Okay. And there is this small pot of money. As I say, it's not mega bucks, but it is, 1,000, 2,000 per venue, which is and it's for things like, it's basically anything that's fixed. So you can't use it for things like furnishings, but if it's kind of nailed or glued down or screwed down, then effectively it's eligible. So it's things like signage is eligible, flooring is eligible, decoration is eligible, things like electrics, plumbing. But I've only got that pot of money till the 31st of March because it's tied to the financial year. So it's a bit of a use it or lose it pot of money. But that's that's there. So if you do find something relative, not everybody can react at this short notice. So that's probably going to end up in, certainly that's not going to work for a space that needs a lot of work on it, because by the time you found somebody to do the work, they do the work and you get in, it's going to be end of March anyway. But if it's a space, it's like, well, it's kind of good to go, but I need to test the electric, I need to give it a coat of paint, I need to put a sign up, but I could basically otherwise be in there in a fortnight. It's for that type of space at the moment where we can, you can do stuff quickly. It's for those sorts of projects.
Okay, great, lovely. You've answered all my questions. Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you.
Howell, you got a question? You're moved.
Just a quick question, Ben. You gave an example there of a gallery, didn't you? I think that was in Swansea City Centre, small space. I think you mentioned it's about 20 by 4 meters. What would the typical rent be for that type of place then, say in the Swansea? I know it'll vary, and perhaps it might be a very difficult question for to answer property to property.
Commercial rent would be round about where that one was, would probably be around about 20 grand, per annum, that sort of thing. But for a meanwhile space, that was zero. That was a free one when we did that one. It was all right. That one actually, because it was a non-profit company, it was a company, it was trading, but it was a not-for-profit company, and so therefore they qualified for business rates relief. So I haven't mentioned that because I don't think anybody on the call is a non-profit. But if you're a non-profit, you can apply for rates relief under any circumstances, whether it's COVID or not. It's discretionary unless if you're a charity, you get 80% mandatory relief on business rates, and the balance of 20% is discretionary. If you're a not-for-profit but not a charity, a registered charity, then it's fully discretionary at the local authorities level. The local authority will probably not give you 100% relief if you're trading, because you are generating money in a space, but you might get 80% if you are, like the Environment Centre went in and did a pop-up shop for its refills project, which is never in a million years going to be commercially viable, and so they did get 100% relief on that, but they were
rent free then, would it?
Yeah, so some spaces are rent free. Yeah, so that particular gallery, that one was a rent free one. Sometimes they will have, like the Quadrant ones, it's roughly 50 quid a day. Because there's service charges and other stuff that's wrapped in with that one. I didn't mention utilities. So the way that utilities work usually depend on how long you're in there for. So if you're in there for 3 months, then the utilities will probably just be signed over to you. If you're only going to be in for a few weeks, normally the landlord, or if there's a superior leaseholder, like we would be, say if we took on the lease as the non-profit and then sub-licensed it, sometimes they will retain the utilities and just recharge the utilities, because it's just simpler than swapping back and forth constantly between utility providers. But utilities are nearly always payable. But generally, that's just passed on at cost. The only thing just to be wary of with that is if you're taking on a space that was formerly used for, say, something which perhaps had a kitchen in it, but you're using it as a retail space, bear in mind that the standing charge for electricity particularly can be very, very high if the supply that's going into the building is designed for a cooking use. So give that example of Unit 19, which I showed you at the beginning. Yeah. Even before I switched on a light switch in Unit 19, there was a flat rate charge of 250 quid a month, even as a meanwhile space from the utility provider, because the space was designed as a nightclub with kitchens and all sorts of stuff. So just bear in mind with that sometimes the standing charge can be high. Something like that unit I showed with the gallery was, akin to a domestic, kind of level of utility cost, because all you're really doing is powering lights and sockets, so you're not drawing lots of power for it. But others can have higher spaces. If you're cooking as well, remember that another thing is sort of related to what I said about kitchens. A lot of premises might not have a gas supply. They will almost all have an electricity supply, unless they're derelict, in which case you probably don't want to touch them for meanwhile space anyway. But not all of them will have a gas supply, because a lot of the heating is electrically powered. So getting a gas supply into a building can be very expensive. It's in there and capped. It's relatively inexpensive then to tap into it. But if it literally isn't going to the building at all, that's very expensive. So just be aware that that can be a high cost. Again, if you're taking a 10-year lease on a space, it's fine. But if you're only in there for a short period of time, just be careful to check that there is actually a gas supply going into the building. And of course, be aware of the fact that gas at the moment anyway is sky high in prices because of the shortage of supplies.
Thank you very much for that.
Rebecca?
One more quick question. Planning. So if you went into a premises that was not used for food previously, and then you're, say, heating food or serving food, does planning come into effect for a meanwhile space or not?
Under COVID, all of the planning rules have basically been relaxed at the moment. So you do need to read up on it, just double check you're okay. But effectively, they're allowing you to flip between uses because they just want activity and commercial activity at the moment. That will probably be relaxed after the 1st of April. The relaxation will probably cease after the 1st of April. To what extent it will cease, I don't know. You'd have to have a look at that. Having said that, even under normal circumstances, flipping between A1 and A3 uses, which is retail and hospitality uses, is generally relatively straightforward, with the exception of the regulatory licensing stuff, which is separate to the planning classification, which is around alcohol licensing or environmental health. That you still have to do all those things regardless of what the planning conditions are. But it's usually relatively straightforward to flip between A1 and A3. Where it gets trickier once we're out of the COVID reliefs is if you wanted to use a shop frontage for something like, let's think of an example. Say you want to do a pop-up cinema. Actually, that's probably a bad one to pick at the moment, given all the controversy that's gone around that. But say you were doing a pop-up cinema, but abiding by the COVID rules, then something like that would be, I think that's a D1 or a D2 classification. And it's probably something that the local authorities say, yeah, we'd quite like that in a town centre. But it's a bit trickier because it's not as simple as flipping between an A1 and an A3 use, which is quite a common practice thing to flip between those uses. Or say you wanted to set up something like... say you wanted to set up a co-working space in an empty shop unit, I think that's a B2 use. And so it's not like a standard practice that you would automatically flip to that in what would otherwise be a retail or a hospitality space. And so that can be a bit more tricky. But have a chat with the planning department. Generally, you'll find a lot on the website. And then you can ask them that question. Again, if it's a meanwhile use, most meanwhile users are A1 or A3 anyway, and most of the spaces you would take for meanwhile use will have an A1 or an A3 planning classification. So usually it's not too big an issue. It's just one or two things around the fringes. But for the type of thing you're doing, it should be relatively straightforward, with the exception of if you want to serve alcohol, you can get an A3 use, but that doesn't guarantee you that you'll get a license to serve alcohol, because there are other sets of criteria that come in around serving of alcohol and cumulative impact of lots of licensed premises in a certain space and proximity to residential and all those other things that come into it, which are an additional layer. So don't assume if you get an A3 you automatically will get an alcohol license. Having said that, you might find it tricky to get an alcohol license if you haven't got A3 planning use on the premises to have hospitality. That's getting into some legal territory. I'm not a lawyer, but but you do have to be a little bit careful around that. And similarly, getting the A3 obviously doesn't get you approved by environmental health. That's also a separate, you will know all of that because you deal with them anyway. But again, that has to be applied to the premises, not just to you as a business.
Okay. So even for a meanwhile space, do you have to apply to environmental health for the premises?
What you were doing in it, but if you're doing anything with food, you would still have to make sure that you were complying with any sort of regulations around environmental health regulations. But as I said, that's why with meanwhile you might want to look at different mechanisms. So if you want to prepare the food on the premises, there's more work involved in that than all you're doing is using the premises as a point of sale. So you look at a lot of the bakers, the bakeries, some of them will bake on site, but a lot of them is baked somewhere else. And the on-site is just a microwave and a point of sale for, you either buy it cold or you have it heated in the microwave. So there's still some food hygiene rules around it, but it's nowhere near as complicated as if you have to set up a full kitchen on site. And so it's often with meanwhile, that might be the better option. Even if your long-term plan is to have a building which has got a kitchen and food preparation, etc., if what you're testing is, will I get enough footfall coming in to buy my product on site? You might still make it in your current premises, but sell it
there.
Sale.
Yeah.
And then if you think, actually, this works, I want to move from a meanwhile lease to a more permanent lease, you can then sort of start, it's then worth you making the investment in putting kitchens in and stuff like that, because you've got longer security of tenure then. You can't have it whisked out from under your feet, having spent 10 or 20 grand on outfitting a kitchen or whatever. You want some security with that because you've made a lot of investment. Whereas in the meanwhile space, you keep your investment quite low. You have to make some investment because you have to buy furniture and stuff like that. You might have to do a few things which aren't eligible for grant, but nevertheless, you're keeping it modest in comparison to your tenure, your period of time that you're in there for.
Okay, great, lovely. Thank you. Thanks, Ben.
Welcome.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ben. Very informative. I think all our participants today have had quite a lot out of the session. So I'm going to wrap it up now and give you a bit more information about some of our activities, events and so on. We've established the Business Swansea Enterprise Club Facebook group, which currently consists of 59 members and is continually growing. This group allows you to ask any questions to myself or Matt from Business Swansea about starting a business and what support is available. It also provides opportunities for members to share their knowledge and experience with others, as well as promoting their new businesses. I'd encourage you to join this group and be a part of this exciting new business network. And there's a link to the Facebook group in the chat. We've also got a monthly Startup Enterprise Club newsletter, and that will keep you updated on all our startup news and support. Again, there's a link in the chat for you to sign up to it. And we've also got another newsletter. It's called the Business Swansea e-newsletter, and that keeps you updated on all forthcoming events, business support news and funding streams via Swansea Council and all our partners. Again, that is there's a link in the chat. I'm going to pass you over to Howell quickly, who's going to tell you about the Barriers to Startup grant via Business Wales, which has recently been launched. So Howell, can I pass over to you?
Very quickly then, Steve. The Welsh Government have recently announced a Barriers to Startup grant, right? Full information is available on the Business Wales website. If you Googled Business Wales Barriers to Startup grant, and it's mainly designed then for under 25s, anyone who's unemployed. It's not, you haven't got to be under 25, anyone can apply for it. Ethnic minorities, women who are starting up businesses, or any young people who want to start up their business and they've got some barriers, maybe financial barriers or other barriers perhaps to starting their business, and you can apply for up to £2,000 to help you get your business up and running. There is some criteria which you'll have to meet, and one of those, you'll have to create a full-time job for yourself. But it is a good opportunity, I think. It's not often that you get free money to start your business, so it's a good opportunity if you have got any barriers to apply for that grant. You have to do your expression of interest. I think there's £1 million fund available. There is an expression of interest email link on the Business Wales website where you'd have to do that pretty quick. So, and tell us briefly what you're going to be doing. There's a barriers team barriers grant team within Business Wales who will be replying to all those emails. Obviously, they're very, very busy with demand for the money at the moment, right? But they will get back to you pretty quickly. So, you know, if there's an opportunity there for you to apply, please get your expression of interest forms in as soon as possible.
Thanks, Hal. I've also put a link in the chat to the
thank you.
Grant, so it'll take you straight through to that particular web page on the Business Wales website. Okay, so I'm going to pass you over now to Matt Callahan, who's going to tell you a bit about our forthcoming Business Support Power Hour events. Matt?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So the Power Hour, the clues in the title does what it says on the tin, really. A session similar to this, but run strictly within a 60 minutes. So the idea behind it, it's a short, sharp delivery of a business-related topic. The audience for this, whilst this session is focused very strongly towards startups, our Power Hour is got a much broader focus. So we're looking to appeal to a range of business, but of course, as part of that, including the startup audience as well. So we've got 2 sessions in the diary, the next of which is in 2 weeks' time. So on the 27th of January, 10 a.m. And the focus and subject for that is branding your business. So whilst you might have a logo and a strapline for your business, and of course they're important, it's getting you to think a little bit more broadly than that in terms of what the branding for your business looks like and how you utilize that brand in terms of communicating with your customers and your business-to-business contacts. The second session in the diary for that is a month following on from that. It's on the 24th of February, again at 10 a.m. And that is accessing funding, making your business funding ready, So looking at a couple of things with regard to that. Firstly, in terms of identifying what funding streams are available for your business. But second to that, once you've identified that funding stream, how can you improve your chances of being successful in accessing that funding stream as well? I'll be sending round the Business Swansea Power Hour e-news later today, and because you've attended this session, I'll make sure that you're included with that as well. So do look out for those 2 sessions and do book on for them because there's some really useful content as part of those as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. I have also, guys, uploaded our Business Swansea Eventbrite page in the chat. So if you do want to register to attend the Power Hour that Matt's just told you about, just click on the link and register, and we look forward to seeing you then. So that's it for today. I'll be sending out feedback forms, relevant links, and invites for our next session. I'd like to thank Ben for giving up his time to come and do the session today. I think we all agree we've had a lot out of it. And we'll keep in touch, and we look forward to seeing you next time. So thanks very much, everyone. See you again.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.